Welcome to a special Saturday edition of Daily Dose of Septuagint. And if you've been following along over the past few videos, we've been looking at Psalm 14 and have seen a lot of connections to Romans 3, but we had stumbled upon verse 3, which was enormous, and I had to do 2 videos on it. And then I showed how it shows up in Romans 3. And in this video, I'm going to finally answer some questions as to what exactly explains the weirdness of Psalm 14 and its connection to Romans 3. And I may not be able to actually explain everything, but I want to outline a few key issues. First off, I'm going to overview the problem. What exactly is going on here? Second, we'll take a look at how the data is reflected in the Greek critical editions. We'll take a look at a selection of Old Testament manuscripts of the Greek Old Testament side of the coin. In other words, how does Psalm 14 or 13 appear in some of the manuscripts? And that creates some of the problems. And then we'll see how some of the scribes tried to grapple with some of these issues. And then I'll offer a few concluding, at least, hypotheses about what maybe explains all of this stuff. So let's begin with an overview of the problem. If you've been following along, you'll notice on the left here we have Psalm 14 in the Masoretic. All have turned away, all have become corrupt. There's no one who does good, not even one. That's verse 3. And then you have in verse 4, will the evildoers never understand, blah, blah, blah. In Psalm 14 in the Greek form, this is what we've been looking at over the past few videos. There is this enormous section here, beginning with the throats are open graves and ending with there is no fear of God before their eyes, that is not found in the Hebrew, but it is found at least in some Old Greek Septuagint manuscripts. And so that is part of what I'm going to try to explain. What exactly is that? Why is it so much longer? I've also pointed out how Psalm 53 or 52 is partly parallel to some of this, as you can see, almost verbatim. What's interesting, though, that in Psalm 53, it doesn't have this big chunk either. And so even though it's almost a doppelganger of Psalm 14, it doesn't have this big chunk there. So it's just very weird, like what's going on? Last thing I'll mention, and if you've been following on, you've seen this, that when Paul gives a series of Old Testament proofs for his point about human sinfulness, kathos ge graptai, so as it has been written, there is no one righteous, et cetera, he has this entire section essentially verbatim with that big long form in Psalm 14. He also actually has verse 3, the rest of verse 3, in fact, verse 1 and 2 are up here as well. So he's seen that. So here's the situation. The Masoretic text does not have this long section. Psalm 53/52 does not either, but Romans does. And so there's this interesting connection between Psalm 14 in the Greek and Romans 3. So that's what I want to try to get behind in this particular video. Now, if you look up Romans 3 in, Nestle Aland or commentaries, or even I have a book coming out on this, sort of the use of the old and the new, there's different opinions as to what exactly Paul is using, because it is clearly a bunch of scriptural quotations. Here's my particular take on it. I think that first line, there's no one righteous, is actually from Ecclesiastes 7. Then the next few lines are from Psalm 14, as we've seen. You can find this, the throat is an open grave and they deceive with their tongues. That is found at least most clearly in Psalm 5. The poison of snakes or asps underneath their lips, that is actually Psalm 140 or 139. Their mouths being full of cursing and bitterness, that's Psalm 10 or 9 in the Greek. The feet shedding blood and all of that, that's Isaiah 59. And then there's no fear of God before their eyes, that would be Psalm 143 or 142. Now, there's some debate on this. Some throw a different psalm in there here and there because some of the clauses are repeated in other parts of it. This is how I would take it in terms of if you take each individual element and you break it down, here are the most clear sources. That's what this is trying to capture. But, as already pointed out in this video, all of them show up in Psalm 14 as well as one big lump sum. And so, again, if you look at a study Bible or the index of your Greek New Testament, you'll typically see something like this explaining this chain of quotations, but it's also found as an entire entity in Psalm 14, and that's the issue that needs explaining. So now let's move on to take a look at how these show up in the critical editions of the Greek Old Testament. We'll look specifically at Rolf's Honhart and the Göttingen edition. First, let's take a look at Rolf's, and so you can tell this is the book of Psalms. It's number 13 because that's the Greek ordering, or iota gamma, which equals 13 in Greek. And so this is the form I've been using, by the way, and it's functionally the same as the Göttingen edition. But you'll notice when we get to verse 3, Pontes exeklinon, hame ekreotheson, so they've all gone astray, and so forth. There is no one who does good, not even one. So we covered that already. Then when you get to the open grave and their throat and all of that, all the way down to there is no fear of God before their eyes, notice what Alfred Rolfs does. He puts a bracket in front of it and then a bracket at the end. That's actually quite uncommon in the world of the Septuagint. You see that all the time in the UBS or Nestle Aland, and typically it refers to texts that maybe are textually disputed, but they're left in because tradition has it. Oh, maybe it's usually there, that kind of thing. Rolfs uses those kinds of things very, very sparingly. You rarely see these brackets, but he's clearly trying to indicate that there's something suspect going on with this entire section. And then you have verse 4 pick up there. What's interesting is that some of the digital editions don't include the bracket, which is why I actually didn't include it in our prior examination. And so it kind of depends on the one you're looking at, but in the the Rolf's Hanhart version, at least, the revised edition, you do have those brackets. Now, if you take a look at the apparatus, which remember, and you can go back and take a look at the Rolf's videos on this, it's a fairly limited apparatus, but he does make a comment here. So notice we're in 3, verses 3 through 10. Remember that greater than sign is omission in Alexandrinus. We'll come back to that. That's pretty much all he says. He claims it is from Romans 3, 13 through 18, where Paul has it basically verbatim, but he also comments, as I just pointed out, that maybe some of this is Psalm 5, 139. He actually says Psalm 9, which I don't necessarily buy that, or at least it's a repetition. Isaiah 59, which I mentioned, in Psalm 35. And it's been put together with Psalm 13 or 14, verse 3. So he's trying to, in Latin, in a very compressed way, somehow explain that what we see here is found in Romans, whereas it may be some combination of a bunch of other passages. But he leaves it in the text with the brackets, so I find that to be interesting and significant. Now, what about the Göttingen edition? Now, it's notable that Rolfs also did the Göttingen edition of the Psalms. So the text itself is almost identical, and you'll notice that we have the bracket here before Taphos, the bracket at the end before verse 4, so he treats it exactly the same way in the Göttingen edition, but he gives us a bigger apparatus explanation. So if we find it here, notice it's once again 3, which should be 13 there, a little bit of a typo. It is found in Vaticanus, so hold that thought. It's found in a few others. I wasn't able to track down images 2019, 1221, a few other witnesses, but then it's obelized. That means the obelisk is used to indicate something that is found in the Greek but not in the Hebrew in the Gallican Psalter, but it's omitted, not only in that recension, Lucianic recension, but also in Alexandrinus. So similar information, just a bit more of it compared to what we saw in the Rolf's Hanhart. And once again, he says it's from Romans 3, 13 through 18, where Paul uses it, and then he has the same stuff there. Apparently, there's a whole discussion of it in some prolegomena that Rolfs has provided. So similar kind of situation here in terms of puts the brackets in there and then shows how some manuscripts have it, some don't, or some put the obelisk with it, which basically says it's in the Greek but not the Hebrew, and therefore need to make it, pay attention that it may not have been authentic. So that's what they look like in the two primary critical editions. Now, just for fun, I looked up the Latin tradition, and so you have the Vulgate here, and then you have the Old Latin. Essentially, the Latin Psalter has a very complicated history where you have an original Latin version that we call the Vetus Latina, or the Old Latin, which was heavily influenced by the Septuagint. Then you have Jerome's one or two other translations, such as the Gallican Psalter, which is heavily indebted to the Septuagint. Then theoretically in the Vulgate, he is supposed to be mostly using the Hebrew. However, he can avoid some cross-pollination from the Septuagint even in that. And so notice the Hebrew here, of course this is in Latin translation, ends where we would expect it to based on the Masoretic with the sort of shorter version of verse 3. And then both the Vulgate and the Vetus Latina, the Old Latin, continue with the other stuff. So the open graves and there's no fear of God before their eyes and that kind of stuff, which is omitted in the Hebrew. And in fact, the Old Latin and the Vulgate here are basically identical. And so Jerome isn't changing much here. But I find it interesting that typically he's going to go back to the Hebrew, but not here. He doesn't appear to just do the shorter reading. He continues with the longer reading, apparently borrowing, or at least heavily indebted, from the Old Latin. The Old Latin itself is heavily indebted to the Septuagint. So kind of an interesting situation there. In other words, the Latin evidence doesn't really help us figure all this out because it seems to ultimately go back to the Septuagint. So on that point, let's now take a look at how some of this shows up in some of the Septuagint manuscripts. Let's begin by taking a look at Codex Vaticanus, or B, because that was one of the ones cited by Rolfs as having this much fuller form of the reading. So you'll notice that this is your iota gamma here, if you can make it out. So that equals 13. And so we got, the fool says in his heart and so forth. We covered that in the prior video. And then now we go down to, all right, all have, fallen away. There's no one who does Christateta uk esten heos henas, not even one. And that's where the Masoretic ends until verse 4. But notice that in Vaticanus, tafas, aneogmenos, so the open grave, and so on, you have the whole thing copied in. And that's the text, essentially, that Rolfs is going to be using. So you do see the full set of extra lines. There's no indication of anything being weird here. It's not like it's marked in the margins. It's just straight up in the text. It actually continues in the next columns. This is, their paths, the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. And then this is verse 4 and following. So we have the ophthalmon, alton, etc. And then it begins with the next verse, verse 4. So Vaticanus has the whole thing, this extra bit in verse 4 that isn't in the Masoretic. Well, what about Codex Sinaiticus, its buddy? And so this is what it looks like in the Sinai Codex S. And so you'll see the iota gamma once again. You got the ace, to telos, to Dawid. Psalmos actually is added to this one if you remember back to the superscript. So a psalm to or of David. Fair enough. Now let's take a look at where verse 3 begins right here, by the way, the Pontes, etc. Now let's take a look at it more closely. If we zoom in, remember the taphos, which is where we get like epitaph, the grave, the open grave is their larynx. So that's where this extra chunk begins, and then it ends with the no fear of God before their ophthalmon, alton, before their eyes. So it also has the text, similar to Vaticanus. However, notice what we have in the left and right margins. Actually, all the way down here as well. And there. You have essentially a deletion marking. It looks kind of like a lunate sigma and an anti-sigma pointing the other direction. So you see it's right here, 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 all the way down. And then you have the same thing here. Most scholars will argue that those are deletion indications, that they didn't want to sort of strike out all of these lines. Although sometimes that happens in Sinaiticus. You'll have either dots put above things, or you'll have even like hash marks, or they'll just scratch the line. Perhaps they didn't want to do that. Don't know. What they did is they marked it in the margins, indicating perhaps to the reader, don't read this, or to the next scribe who's going to copy from this, don't copy this. Whatever the case may be, this is not the original scribe of Sinaiticus. This is a later deorthotes or corrector. They are saying, hey, these lines are suspect. But the original scribe of Codex Sinaiticus in the mid to late 300s did write the text in there. So that is really, really interesting that in the history of this manuscript, you have this fluidity. It's almost like a little miniature critical edition where they're trying to mark these lines for deletion. What about the final one of our big three of the majuscules, Codex Alexandrinus? So I had some videos on this recently. It's not the best scan here, but it's good enough. Let's take a look at this particular psalm. Notice the iota gamma once again over here. So this is Psalm 13. So Apen, Aphron, En, Cardia, Al2, etc. So the fool says in his heart, fair enough. Now, what I find really interesting is that almost certainly because of this repetition of there is no one who does Christateta, remember that line is repeated in Psalm 3, they apparently originally left out a bunch of stuff. And so someone had to go in and add that back, and it may be the original scribe. You can sort of tell with the C here. I haven't studied Alexandrinus in enough detail to know, but it looks like maybe the same scribe said, wait a second, I left something out. Let me go and add verse 2 in here. So there's already a little bit of noise going on with the psalm here. That's why they squeeze it into the bottom margin. But if we go up to the top of the next column, you have the everyone has fallen away. There is no one who does Christatita. There's that line that's repeated. That probably caused the omission of the prior bit here. And we would expect the long form, including like the taphos, et cetera, to be here. And it's absent. This is the end of verse 3. And this is the start of verse 4. Now, that's the shorter version of verse 3. Then no one knows, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't have the longer reading here. That's why Alexandrinus was listed like in Rolf's and the Göttingen edition, which is also basically Big Boy Rolf's, as omit Alexandrinus. So it has no indication that it was there whatsoever. So that's pretty interesting. So you got two magischules that have it. Although one of those has evidence of a later scribe having some suspicions about it, but Alexandrinus from, call it the 400s, early 500s, lacks it altogether. What about some other manuscripts? This is Rolf's 1221, not really a famous manuscript, but it does have a lot of interesting stuff going on in the Psalms. It's not a complete manuscript. It's housed in Vienna. And this is one of the ones that was listed in the apparatus as having the longer form. So let's take a look at that. So we have the Kyrios, notice the nomen sacrum, ek tu uranu, also a nomen sacrum for heaven, dia kupsen, so he looks down upon the sons of men, etc., etc. We have the Pontes, exeklinon, so they've all fallen away, so we're getting warm, so now we're in verse 3. Go to the next folio. Heos, Henos, etc. Now we have Taphos, and some of it's smudged out. Throat is an open grave. You have all the next lines. This longer form of verse 3 shows up in this manuscript. It's kind of interesting. It's also introduced with a dicolon here, but that's pretty normal. You got a raised dot here. So they're just punctuating it like you normally would. They don't have any indication that it's weird or suspect in any sort of way. It's just there in this manuscript. This manuscript is rather late, actually. It's a few hundred years after Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, so perhaps it's drawing on that particular branch of the tradition. In contrast, we have a much later minuscule, Rolf's 65. This one's housed in Leipzig. It's actually a bilingual manuscript, so it has Greek on the left, Latin on the right. Now, I'm not familiar enough with this manuscript to know if that's the Old Latin or perhaps the Vulgate or something like that. And so this is much, much later. It's actually a minuscule handwriting, as you can see. And here, maybe we'll get into some minuscule script down the road, but we have the Pontes, exeklinon, etc. There's no, uk estin poion krestateta. So no one does good things. Uk estin heos henos. So that's the end of verse 3. And then you go straight into verse 4. And when I say into verse 3, the shorter version of verse 3. There is no longer version. It would be right there. Instead, you go right into verse 4. So by this point, in most of the minuscules, you don't actually have the longer reading. And so that is an example, a few examples of how the Greek Old Testament manuscripts appear, whether they have the longer form of verse 3 or not. Final protocol is to take a look at how do some scribes handle this in Romans 3. So let's take a look at that. Let's take a look first at Vaticanus, because we started there. Now, this is the Romans portion of Codex Vaticanus, and you'll notice that we have the kathos gegraptai, so as it has been written, and then we got the hati introducing the quote, uk estin dikaios, there's no one righteous, etc., etc. We have the pontes exeklinon, hama ekoritheson, so we've seen that in Psalm 14. And the thing I want to draw your attention to is that the scribe marks all of this with these dipples, or diple in Latin. That's a very common way of indicating quoted text. It's not unique to Christians. We've probably seen this in prior videos as well. So the whole thing actually going all the way down is marked with those dipples in the margin. So that's pretty interesting. So the whole thing is marked as a scripture quotation. What about Sinaiticus or Sinaiticus? Same passage, we've got the kathos gegraptai. You got the same use of dipples, but I want to draw your attention to a very interesting thing that a later scribe, a later corrector or editor of Sinaiticus added in the margin. Now, it's difficult to make this out, but this says psalmoi or psalms, and then you have a iota gamma, if you can see that, couldn't take a very good picture here, and then an NB. What is that? Well, the iota gamma is 13, and the NB is 52. Remember, 52, I'll cover this at the very beginning, is essentially a partial repetition of Psalm 13. So this scribe is actually aware that both of these two psalms have, in effect, this entire thing. That's really fascinating, because whoever is this corrector or editor says this whole thing is from one place, and it's either Psalm 14 or 13 in the Septuagint numbering, or Psalm 53 in Masoretic 52 in the Greek numbering. The whole thing is from that. That's notable because it could very well be the exact same scribe, the same editor, who went back to Psalm 14, and if you remember, marked those lines with these deletion markings. He still thinks, though, that this quotation is from that entire psalm. So whoever that is, he still thinks of Psalm 14:3 as being this whole thing. What about Alexandrinus? You just got the dipples in the margin. No other indication, but the whole thing is marked as a quotation. Now let's go a little bit farther into the future. We're going to look at GA 1739. That's Gregory Alon 1739. If you know anything about New Testament textual criticism, in the epistles of Paul, this manuscript, even though it's quite late in the game, this Middle Ages time frame, is really, really important and has an early text. But I'm not going to focus on the text here. I'm going to focus on the paratext. Notice that you have the same use of dipples for this Romans 3 quotation. Now we have some interesting stuff. First off, you have a marginal attribution. It's also Psalms. To me, that looks like a iota sigma and then a nu beta. That's what it looks like to me, and that would be Psalm 16. Now, it could be that the scan here is just not ideal, but that certainly doesn't look like a gamma to me, and so maybe they just misnumbered. Next one is Psalm, and then you have an epsilon. That's Psalm 5, so that was one of the clear other passages. Then you have Proverbs, proomii, and I'm not sure which one has that particular line. You got some other stuff here, marginal annotation. Then you have, once again, you have Psalm 35, which I find to be interesting. I couldn't really track down a great example of 35. There's one little snippet about, rejecting God in Psalm 35. But either way, this scribe actually takes that from Psalm 35, which wouldn't be my go-to. What I find interesting about this is that this scribe is trying to think through, where are these passages from? He doesn't think they're all from Psalm 14. He thinks there are other options on the table. So perhaps for this particular scribe, either he doesn't know Psalm 14, verse 3 in its full form, or he's aware that, hey, wait a second, it can't all be from that. It's splicing together a bunch of different passages. I just am not sure he gets them all right. Another good example is minuscule 1424, Gregory Alon. This one has a lot of paratext. I just want to point out two things. He has Psalms here in the margin, and then he has Isaiah here in the margin, a bunch of commentary around it. So he just says, look, a big chunk of Romans 3:10 and following is from the Psalms, and there's a portion from Isaiah. So he's right on that front. He does not number which psalm he thinks this is from, or at least I can't make it out because there's so much other writing there. Last thing we'll point out is the Euthalian apparatus. Now, this is a really, really interesting set of paratextual features. There's debate about who exactly penned it. It's attributed to this guy named Euthalius, who may have been a deacon in, call it the 500s, 600s, but there's a lot of debate about whether he actually did it. And it covers Acts, the Pauline epistles, and the Catholic epistles. It includes like backstories of where these writings were written and who Paul is, what his journeys were. But for our purposes, he also has a set of so-called divine testimonies. That is, in Acts or in Romans or 1 Corinthians, what have you, what are the Old Testament passages that are being cited? It's actually really helpful stuff, really innovative for its day. If you want to read it, the scan's not great here, but it's in the Patrologia Graeca series, volume 85. You can find that for free on the internet. So this is the Romans 3 portion. And notice he says it is Psalm Iota Gamma. So that's your Psalm 13. Great. And Nu Beta, which is 52. And then Uk Estin Dikaios, Ude Haste, etc., etc. So here's what's interesting is that he cites Psalm 14 for a big chunk of it up to Heos Henos. Then he says, okay, beginning with the grave and ending with full of bitterness, we're going to assign that to Psalm Epsilon, which is Psalm 5. Now, he's partly right here. However, as far as I'm aware, this section from the venom of asp and so forth, that's not actually in Psalm 5. So even though he does correctly note that all of this is not necessarily from Psalm 13, he says, wait a second, Psalm 5's in the mix. He doesn't get some of the other details. Then when you get to they swiftly shed blood, that kind of stuff, he says this is from Isaiah the prophet. He doesn't go back, though, to the Psalms. He just leaves the rest of it, including the way of peace they have not known and so forth. He says that's also in Isaiah, but that's not true. That's from the Psalms as well. So pretty interesting. This is also a scholar who's trying to figure out where are all these things from. And similar to some of the other predecessors, he gets some of it right, maybe get some of it wrong. None of them really have come to the decisive conclusion as to where all this stuff is from. So if you want to find out more about the euthalion apparatus and so forth, there's 2 great books on it. You can find those, one by Willard and one by Blomqvist. So I'll leave that for you to take a look at on your own. Let's draw things together with some conclusions. So here's one theory that maybe explains some of this, that maybe some scribe in the Jewish community had already pulled together these passages into a testimonium. A testimonium is like a list of your favorite Bible verses that all have some sort of collective theme. Some have argued that maybe Paul is using that he's not actually citing Psalm 14 or Psalm 5 or Isaiah, but he's using a testimonium, some little scrap that has, hey, here's a bunch of Bible passages about how bad people are. So that's one theory. One theory is that perhaps Paul is just quoting Psalm 14 in a form that we now know it in, say, Vaticanus, and that somebody had already put all this stuff together. He's simply quoting one place. It's a variant Greek tradition that deviates from the Masoretic. Maybe he's in Corinth, and this just happens to be the version of the psalm that they have in front of them. So he doesn't smash together a bunch of verses. It's already been done in a different form of Psalm 14 that is reflected in a part of the tradition that deviates from the Masoretic. The final option is, in terms of explaining Psalm 14, is that, okay, Paul is the one who actually puts all this together, which, by the way, that would be his biggest conflation of multiple scripture passages. He does do this in other places, but this would be the biggest one over the longest stretch, that he says, hey, let me take a bunch of verses and throw them all together. And then what happened, if he does that in Romans 3, a later scribe who is working on Psalm 14 says, wait a second, or Psalm 13, wait a second, I am familiar with all of this being together in Romans 3, and so let me throw this in Psalm 14. Of course, that should be 13, small typo there. So that would be called secondary assimilation. In other words, Paul is the one who put them all together in Romans 3, and then a later Christian says, okay, let me just copy and paste all of that into Psalm 14, because Psalm 14 is the first place that he goes. And I think that's probably the theory that Rolfs is operating under, that it was a scribe who did this secondary assimilation and basically pulled from Romans and then pasted it into Psalm 14/13. Now, the problem with that is that this would be by far the biggest instance of that phenomenon. Generally speaking, we don't see scribes do that as a rule. It does happen, but we don't often see them say, hey, let me take a quote from Hebrews and then retcon that back into Isaiah or the Psalms so that they match. Again, there are a few places where it probably is happening, but it's by far the exception, not the rule. And it certainly doesn't happen on this scale where it's like 8 verses where this happens. So here's where I land on this. I simply don't know. I think there's advantages to each of these theories in terms of explaining why you have the longer form in Psalm 14, verse 3. I think, the testimony theory, okay, that kind of is neat, but it requires someone to do that kind of work. The variant Greek tradition, I think that has some explanatory power, but that still requires the wonder, well, why did a scribe do that? Why do they pull from Psalm 5 and Isaiah 59, all that kind of stuff, put it all together? The secondary assimilation is probably the leading theory, but the problem is that is an enormous scribal blunder to do that, to take Romans 3, verses 10 through 18 and paste it into Psalm 14 to expand it so significantly. So I ultimately am not sure how to explain this complexity behind verse 3 of Psalm 14 and how it relates to Romans 3. But I'd be curious to see what you think. Leave some comments in the chat at below. But hopefully this has been a fun exploration of some of the ins and outs of what I find to be one of the more interesting textual conundra in the Greek Old Testament, the relation between Psalm 14 and Romans 3. Well, it's been long enough. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.